Ginny King looked at her, a flicker of indifference flashing in her eyes, but she still said with a neutral tone, "Hello, Ms. Heron. I didn't expect you to attend the banquet as well." Faith Heron smiled and replied, "My Heron group just entered J City, so I naturally need to build good relations with the established families here." "Now I understand." Faith smiled at Zane Soulsby, saying, "Mr. Soulsby, long time no see." Zane felt a bit awkward. Ginny had repeatedly told him not to get too close to Faith. Now that she was greeting him, he wasn't sure how to respond. Seeing this, Faith raised an eyebrow and thoughtfully remarked, "Miss King's ability to manage her husband is quite admirable." Ginny furrowed her brow and turned to Zane, saying, "Miss Heron is talking to you, why aren't you responding to her? Is this how you show your manners?" Zane nearly spat out a mouthful of blood. "Wasn't it you who told me not to get too close to her? Women are truly hard to read." Zane put on a serious face and said to Faith, "Hello, Miss Heron." Faith smiled slightly and walked in on her high heels. After she left, Ginny's fingers dug into Zane's waist and twisted hard. "You were just staring so intently." Zane winced in pain, forcing a smile. "No, I absolutely wasn't looking." Ginny snorted and linked her arm with Zane as they walked inside. Ding! Storyshots reminds you to click the subscribe button at the bottom right corner to read the full novel. While taking the elevator, Ginny suddenly said, "Was the necklace Miss Heron was wearing a diamond or a gem?" "It was quite beautiful." "Oh, it was a gem," Zane replied. As soon as he said it, he regretted it, turning around to find Ginny staring directly at him. Her gaze was dangerous. Zane awkwardly chuckled, "That necklace was indeed beautiful, which is why I looked." Ginny coldly huffed and released Zane's arm. "Great." Zane wanted to slap himself. He hadn't expected the strong-willed Ginny to be this terrifyingly jealous. Watching Ginny walk ahead, Zane hurried to catch up with her. He didn't say a word, just silently followed her, looking aggrieved. Ginny noticed and secretly smiled. He needed to be taught a lesson. Otherwise, Faith, that vixen, would definitely be able to lure him away. The banquet hall was large, with no less than 100 tables set up. Ginny glanced at him before chatting and laughing with the people around her. Zane walked to a corner and sat down. Though he had come to make friends, it wasn't good to be too obvious. To be precise, Zane's personality wouldn't allow him to actively seek out connections. "Zane Soulsby?" Suddenly, a surprised voice rang out beside him. Zane turned to see Gaylord White approaching with a look of astonishment. Zane frowned slightly. He didn't want to have anything to do with Gaylord. Gaylord seemed oblivious to Zane's expression and sat down beside him, smiling. "Thanks for what you did at the bar last time." Zane grunted, showing no intention to converse. Gaylord looked at Zane with curiosity. "I'm really curious about who you are." "Of course, if you don't want to say, that's fine too." Zane replied, "I really don't want to say." Gaylord's face stiffened for a moment, then he smiled as usual. "Zane, did your wife bring you to the banquet?" Zane nodded. Gaylord said, "Your wife treats you really well. You know, the Orne family and the Yates family are top-tier families in J City. Their marriage would elevate their status to that of a top family. I don't even qualify to attend such high-status banquets. I had to spend money and find many people to get in. Yet your wife brought you in." Zane was getting impatient. "What exactly do you want to say?" Gaylord looked at Zane seriously. "I want to collaborate with you." Zane scoffed. "What makes you think I'm qualified to collaborate with you, young Master White?" Gaylord didn't seem to catch Zane's sarcasm and continued smiling. "I looked into King Group, and to my knowledge, they currently have a 200 million shortfall. If you collaborate with me, I can offer her a project worth 200 million. Zane's interest was piqued. Ginny had been troubled by that 200 million recently. "How do you want to collaborate with me?" "The Jack Castro in the East has been causing me trouble. You just need to help me resolve this, and I will give King Group a project worth 200 million. "Is it really that simple?" Zane asked. Gaylord smiled. "Of course not. From now on, whenever my white group is troubled by those ruffians, you'll need to step in and help me out." Zane understood. He wanted to pay for protection. However, the protection fee he was asking for was a bit low. 200 million to ensure his protection for life? That was quite a bargain. After all, some groups pay as much as 50 million or even 100 million per year to those ruffians for protection. Zane raised his head, looking at him with a half-smile. Gaylord remained unfazed and continued. "Of course, you can choose not to help me. I've estimated King Group's current financial situation. At their current rate, they can only last for 2 months. Meanwhile, my White Group, although losing money every day, can afford to lose for 10 or 8 years without a problem." He was threatening Zane. Zane's eyes flashed with a hint of anger, then he said, "Sorry, I'm just an ordinary person and can't help you." Gaylord White frowned and said in a deep voice, "Zane, we are classmates. I don't want to be your enemy." "Do you think you are worthy of being my enemy?" Zane retorted. Coldness filled Gaylord's eyes. "If that's the case, then I hope you won't regret it, Zane Soulsby." With that, he turned and left. Zane scoffed. A mere heir of the White Group really thought he was something special. He took out his phone and sent Mr. Six a text. "Help me check the situation with the White Group." Mr. Six was efficient, and soon he sent over a document. Zane opened it, read for a while, and let out a laugh. The White Group had entered J City 3 years ago and was fairly strong, ranking as a third-tier company in J City. However, the headquarters of the White Group was in M City and was quite powerful. Jackson White had 2 sons, one was Gaylord White, and the other was Hank White. Currently, Jackson had retired to the background, handing everything over to the 2 brothers, Gaylord and Hank. Now the group was facing a tricky problem. Jackson had said that whoever could solve the issue would become the heir of the White Group. Becoming the heir of the White Group also meant a chance to return to the White family in M City. It could be said that the significance of this heir was immense. Thus, Gaylord had come to the banquet, looking for partners to help him solve the problem. Upon seeing Zane, he remembered Zion Hall's attitude towards Zane and thought Zane could solve it. He even offered $200 million, believing that this amount would leave Zane extremely grateful. But he never expected Zane to refuse. And refuse so decisively. Gaylord was someone who smiled at everyone and was very generous, but those who knew him understood that he was ruthless and far more cunning than Hank. Now, Gaylord had thought of a good way to deal with Zane. Since Zane had refused, he would make him come begging on his knees. Zane put away his phone, thinking Amir Group was acting like a royal family contesting for power. Those who didn't know might think it was a movie. Soon, Mr. Six sent another document. This was Hank's document. He was a bastard child, always living in the shadows. Because of being a bastard, he was very insecure and had a dark personality. He had no friends since childhood and was even more ruthless towards enemies. Zane closed his phone and shut his eyes. In fact, the matter regarding the White Group was easy to resolve. All it required was protection money. $200 million would be enough to keep Mr. Six people from bothering them. But Gaylord didn't have it, and Zane wondered where he got the confidence to go against Mr. Six people. "Hello?" A voice rang out. Zane turned to see a young man standing beside him. He looked somewhat similar to Gaylord. Upon seeing him, Zane immediately realized that Gaylord was looking for partners here, so he naturally came to find partners too. Zane held no good feelings towards these 2 brothers and nodded lightly. Hank's voice was cold. Even when he forced a smile, it still gave off a gloomy vibe. "Was that my brother just now? Did he say anything to you?" Zane's heart stirred. He turned to look at him. "He wants to cooperate with me." "Cooperate?" Hank's eyes sparkled, and he sat down. "Can you tell me more?" Zane replied nonchalantly. "The guy from the East City, Jack Castro, has been looking for trouble with him and hopes I can talk to Jack and let them off." "You agreed?" Hank stared at Zane without blinking. Zane smiled and said, "No, he wants to pay me $200 million to protect him for life." "This deal seems like a loss to me." Hank's eyes narrowed slightly, then he asked, "Who are you, if I may ask?" "My name is Zane Soulsby." "Mr. Soulsby, can you really solve the problems in East City?" Zane laughed. "Don't mention just East City. If I want to, I can make waves throughout all of J City." Hank's eyes sparkled, and he stood up, extending his hand. "Let's get acquainted. I'm Hank White, the heir of the White Group." "Hello, Zane Soulsby." Hank said, "I want to cooperate with you." Zane shrugged and remained silent. Hank continued, "As long as you cooperate with me, I will give you $100 million in protection money every year, plus annual dividends from the group. Roughly calculated, that's $150 million a year." Zane smiled and said, "Good ambition, but I don't think I'm short on money." Hank asked, "Then what does Mr. Soulsby lack?" "I'll help you take control of the White Group, and then your White Group will merge with my flying technology company." Hank pulled out his phone, searched for a moment, and said, "I couldn't find any information about flying technology company online." "It will be there tomorrow." Hank's expression turned slightly ugly. "Mr. Soulsby, are you playing me for a fool?" There's no point in playing games with you. What I value is not how much the white group is worth, but the channels you have that could help my company in the future. But you don't even have a company. Why should I believe you? Zane said softly. If you didn't believe me, you wouldn't be here chatting with me for so long. Hank stared at Zane. I haven't seen your status in the community. Does Mr. Six know? Of course, the big boss of J City. Zane replied. Flying technology company has shares owned by Mr. Six, and I'm good friends with him. That's just talk. Zane shrugged. Whether you believe it or not is your business. Hank's eyes flickered. After a moment, he gritted his teeth and said, Fine, I agree. However, the white group cannot be merged into Flying Technology Company. I can only give you 30% of the shares in the white group. And the channels of the white group will be prioritized for use by Flying Technology Company. Zane thought seriously for a moment, then suddenly laughed. All right, it's a deal. What about the situation in the east of the city? Tomorrow night, I'll go with you to find Jack Castro. Good. Hank took out a business card and handed it to Zane. Let's not make it so complicated. Let's just exchange phone numbers. Also, once this matter is resolved, I'll find a professional lawyer, and we can sign a contract. Sure, no problem. Zane exchanged phone numbers with him and cheerfully said, You have more guts than your brother, but at the same time, your ambition is smaller. Hank understood what Zane meant. He bit his lip and said softly, As an illegitimate child who can already be considered a successor is already a blessing from heaven. I wouldn't even dare to think about going back to the white family in M City. Why wouldn't you dare to think about it? You've already agreed to cooperate with me. Zane said quietly, then turned his gaze to the center of the crowd where Ginny was. Hank listened to Zane's words and suddenly fell into deep thought. After a moment, he raised his head and said seriously, If you can help me return to the white family in M City, I'll give you 51% of the shares in the white group, allowing you to have absolute control. Let's talk about the future later. Seeing Zane show signs of impatience, he said his goodbyes and left. At that moment, the lights dimmed. Beautiful music began to play. The chandelier above emitted colorful lights, and the entire banquet hall was filled with a romantic atmosphere. Two groups of people walked out, all dressed in custom-made suits and expensive evening gowns. As they appeared, everyone immediately began to applaud. They were from the Orrin and Yates families. Stepping onto the stage, the parents of both families exchanged pleasantries for a moment, and then a man and a woman walked out. The man was handsome but pale, looking as if he was suffering from an illness. The woman next to him was beautiful, her eyes dim. She seemed dissatisfied with this political marriage. In fact, she looked quite disgusted. But for families like theirs, political marriages were the norm, and she couldn't escape that fate. Colin Orrin looked at Trisha Yates with gentle eyes, not hiding his affection. Trisha's gaze flickered, but she still intertwined her fingers with his. David Orrin, the chairman of the Orrin Group, stood up and said loudly, Thank you all for taking the time to attend my son's engagement ceremony. I am very grateful. Everyone echoed in agreement. The Orrin Group was already top tier in J City, and a marriage with the Yates family would elevate them to the pinnacle of J City's elite. Everyone looked at Trisha Yates with envy and jealousy. Rumor had it that if Trisha agreed to marry Colin, she would be made the heir of the Yates Group. In simple terms, after marriage, Trisha would leap from being an illegitimate daughter to the heir of the Yates Group, eventually controlling the Yates Group. However, Trisha didn't seem happy at all. She occasionally glanced toward the entrance. In the distance, Zane noticed and raised an eyebrow, revealing a meaningful look. David Orrin continued reading the prepared speech, and out of excitement, he even announced two major projects as gifts for the attendees. At this, everyone gasped in surprise. Even Ginny King clenched her fists. She had heard of these two projects, worth $1 billion. If she could get them, not only would her company be saved, but it could also advance to the next level. However, just as everyone was excited, the door suddenly burst open with a kick. The unexpected noise startled everyone, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. A young man walked in, wearing a white suit and looking handsome. Unlike Colin's sickly appearance, he exuded a strong and resolute aura. I object, the young man shouted loudly. As his voice fell, a group of men in black tight-fitting clothes rushed in, moving quickly to surround everyone in the banquet hall. With their hands raised, they all brandished gleaming guns. Zane froze for a moment and narrowed his eyes slightly. Today's banquet was getting interesting. Taking advantage of the distraction, he walked over to Ginny and took her hand. Ginny looked at all the people and the numerous guns, her face turning pale. Colin's expression was extremely grim as he gritted his teeth and said, "Fred Larkin." "Fred." Tricia, seeing him appear, burst into tears. Hearing Colin and Tricia's addresses, the families of Orne and Yates turned ashen. As their elders, they had naturally heard of Fred Larkin. Tricia and Fred had grown up together, their bond strong from childhood, and they had even secretly vowed to be together for life. However, Fred's family had fallen on hard times, and he disappeared afterward. Since then, Fred had become Tricia's obsession, her idealized lover. "Fred Larkin, are you seeking death?" Colin gritted his teeth and said. Fred didn't even glance at him, instead turning to Tricia with deep affection and saying, "Tricia, as long as you don't agree, no one can take you away from me." "Fred!" Tricia wailed, releasing Colin's hand. "Tricia, I love you, and I can't bear to see you marry someone else," Fred said passionately. Tricia covered her mouth, her eyes filled with love. "Fred Larkin!" David Orne was furious, his face pale, as he gritted his teeth and said, "What do you want to do?" Fred took a deep breath, calming his emotions, his expression returning to neutrality. "To snatch my bride, can't you see?" Wade Yates said coldly, "Fred, I know you like Tricia, but look at yourself now. Are you the same as before? You're just a rat in a stinking ditch, hated by everyone. After today, the state will classify you as a wanted criminal. Can you still give Tricia happiness? If you really love Tricia, you should learn to let go." "Shut up." Fred's previously calmed emotions suddenly erupted, and he abruptly pulled out a handgun. Bang! Everyone was startled by him. With red eyes, Fred said, "Tricia and I are childhood sweethearts. You once promised to marry her to me. But because my family fell on hard times, you looked down on me. You even used Tricia as a bargaining chip to marry her off to the Orne family. Do you know that Tricia loves me and not him at all?" Wade's face darkened. "She is my daughter, and I will decide her marriage." "Damn you and your daughter. After you gave birth to her, did you ever care for her and her mother? Once you learned Colin liked Tricia, you sent people to bring her back. To you, she is not your daughter but a pawn for your interests. Wade Yates, let me tell you, if you weren't Tricia's biological father, I would kill you right now." At these words, everyone looked at Wade in astonishment. Ginny clenched her fists, instinctively glancing at Zane. Zane said softly, "Childhood sweethearts, idealized lovers. Sounds quite familiar." Ginny rolled her eyes, "Shut up." Fred took a deep breath, gazing deeply at Tricia. "Tricia, come with me, let's go abroad and live our own world together." Tricia's expression struggled. "Tricia Yates, if you dare to leave, you will no longer be my daughter," Wade said coldly. Tricia's struggle suddenly vanished, revealing a hint of bitterness as she turned to her father. "Fred is right, do you even treat me as your daughter?" Wade's expression shifted slightly. Tricia turned to Colin and softly said, "I'm sorry, I still can't forget him." Colin's face showed bitterness, his eyes forlorn. Tricia's gaze turned apologetic, then she hurriedly ran towards Fred, dragging her skirt. "Tricia Yates, you dare!" Wade's eyes turned red. "Someone, hurry and stop them." As soon as he finished speaking, a group of security guards rushed in. Seeing this, Zane chuckled, these guards were indeed diligent. Fred held Tricia's delicate hand, a murderous intent flashing in his eyes, as he coldly commanded, "Anyone who blocks me dies." The atmosphere was tense. The security guards looked at the weapons in Fred and the others' hands, hesitating to step forward. With a monthly salary of only $3,000, who would risk their lives? Wade was furious, helplessly watching as Fred, with a mocking expression, took Tricia away. Meanwhile, David, after a brief moment of anger, surprisingly calmed down. Once Fred left, he showed his anger again, snorting coldly, waving his sleeve, and turning to leave. However, before leaving, he said, "Whoever can bring them back, I'll give them those 2 projects." Everyone exchanged glances, feeling somewhat helpless. The banquet ended on a sour note. As they exited the banquet hall, Faith Heron approached Ginny with a smile, saying, "Congratulations." Ginny looked puzzled, confused as she asked Faith, "Congratulations on what?" Faith smiled without answering. While others dared not approach Fred or catch him, Zane was bold enough to find him. Faith left. Today was quite a spectacle, she needed to go back and tell her friends. The next day, the Orne family would become the target of everyone's ridicule. It was already shameful for a biological son to marry an illegitimate daughter. But now, during the engagement, the fiancé was snatched away by someone else. This was a monumental disgrace. On the way home, Ginny was thinking about what Faith had said, completely unaware of Zane playing on his phone. Just as they were about to reach home, Ginny suddenly said, "Zane, if one day, Trisha Yates's role were to switch with mine, would you, like Fred Larkin, disregard what others think and come to propose to me?" Without thinking, Zane replied, "Of course, and I'd do it even more ruthlessly than he would." Ginny smiled. Ignoring the fact that he was driving, she leaned over and gave Zane a quick kiss on the cheek. When they got home, Maria Carr was already asleep. However, she was in Ginny's room. What she was thinking was clear to both Ginny and Zane. Ever since they became a couple, they had never actually shared a room together. They had fought, made up, and then fought again. After finally clearing up the misunderstandings, Maria woke up and unceremoniously took over Ginny's room. Zane held Ginny's hand seriously and said, "Ginny, why don't you stay in the guest room with me tonight?" Ginny's charming face flushed slightly, and just as she was about to speak, Maria's voice came from upstairs. "Ginny, I need to talk to you." Ginny showed a helpless expression and could only say apologetically to Zane, "I'm sorry, Mom just woke up, and she really needs me. In a few days, I promise." At this, she shyly covered her face. Zane looked displeased. Ginny hesitated for a moment, kissed him on the lips, and then dashed upstairs. Zane touched the spot where she had kissed him, feeling a bit helpless. If she wanted to leave, why stir up trouble? He returned to the guest room and lay in bed, unable to fall asleep. He tossed and turned. Finally, he simply sat up, crossed his legs, and began to practice his cultivation techniques. The next day, Zane opened his eyes, a glimmer of light flashing in them. The corners of his mouth lifted, and the details of his memories became clearer. Pushing open the door, he saw Maria practicing yoga on the mat. He had to admit that Maria, coming from a prominent family, had an impressive figure. However, after being bedridden for years, although her body had recovered, her physique hadn't returned to its youthful form. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and she cried out in pain. She had twisted her waist. Zane walked over, watching her pained expression with a gleeful look in his eyes. Maria glared at Zane, gritting her teeth in pain as she said, "Zane, your mother-in-law is in agony, and you're just standing there laughing. Are you even human?" Zane shrugged and replied, "I'm worried that if I touch you, you'll tell Ginny that I'm taking advantage of you." "You?" Maria, furious and embarrassed, shouted, "Hurry and help me up." Zane responded quickly, rushing over to assist her. As he helped her up, he gently pressed his hands on her waist, and with a cracking sound, Maria was about to scream but suddenly froze. "All better." She looked at Zane in surprise. The next moment, the door swung open, and Ginny entered with breakfast. Seeing the position Zane and Maria were in, she froze on the spot. Zane was behind Maria, supporting her waist, while Maria, having twisted her waist, was leaning back. The position looked very suggestive. Seeing this, Maria turned around and slapped Zane's face, angrily saying, "You scoundrel, taking advantage of me while I'm practicing yoga. How could you do this to Ginny?" Zane twitched his mouth. He had expected this reaction, but now that it had happened, anger surged within him. Seeing Ginny's pained expression, he wasted no time and pulled out his phone to check the surveillance footage. He placed the phone in front of Ginny. Ginny glanced at it, and as she listened to the sounds coming from the speaker, her face turned ugly. "Zane, your mother-in-law is in agony, and you're just standing there laughing. Are you even human? I'm worried that if I touch you, you'll tell Ginny that I'm taking advantage of you. You? Hurry and help me up." Maria's face turned awkward, and she explained softly, "Ginny, I'm just helping you two build your relationship." Ginny took a deep breath and said, "Mom, it seems that Zane can't stay here to take care of you anymore. I'll find you two maids, just tell them what you need." "Ginny." Maria panicked. If she couldn't see Zane, how could she cause trouble and frame him? "Mom, men and women shouldn't be too close, even if it's a mother-in-law and son-in-law," Ginny said coldly. "Ginny, That's settled." After saying that, Ginny placed the breakfast on the table and turned to leave. Zane followed, but Maria grabbed him. Maria glared at Zane with gritted teeth, "You shameless scoundrel, installing surveillance in your own home." Zane smiled and said, "Mother-in-law, I'm just worried about burglars breaking in." After that, he forcibly pulled her hand away, ignoring her fiery glare, and walked out. "Ah!" Maria Carr shouted in anger, pushing all the breakfast on the table to the floor. Stepping outside, Zane smiled slightly. Once in the car, Ginny looked at Zane, deep in thought. Zane paused for a moment and asked, "What's wrong?" Ginny replied, "Nothing. Are you coming with me to the company today?" "No way, it's too boring at the company. I want to go out and explore." "Where to?" "To the Red Star Billiards Hall to play some pool." "Alright, I'll take you there." The Red Star Billiards Hall was a venture from Mr. Six's earlier days. Over the years, it had fallen out of favor, and naturally, it wasn't making any money anymore. But Mr. Six couldn't bear to shut it down, so he kept it open for the people below to play pool for free. From the outside, the billiards hall looked quite shabby, but inside, it was very luxurious. Top-notch billiard tables, each reportedly worth nearly $300,000. The cues here cost over $10,000 each. One has to admit, Mr. Six was quite generous to the people below. Otherwise, he wouldn't have risen so quickly and outpaced the other three big brothers. Walking into a tea room inside, Mr. Six was busy with accounts when he saw Zane and quickly stood up. "Mr. Soulsby, we found the person, he's inside." Zane smiled and said, "In this small territory, even if Fred Larkin brought in mercenaries, it wouldn't matter. Take me to meet him." Mr. Six pulled open a bookshelf, revealing a hidden door. They entered, and inside was a suite. It had everything, a bed, a sofa, you name it. Fred Larkin and Tricia Yates looked at Zane with fear on their faces. Zane said nothing but sat down, smiling at the two. Fred took a deep breath and asked, "Who are you, and why did you capture us?" Zane replied, "Last night, after you left, Mr. Orne said that whoever could capture you would be rewarded with 2 projects worth $10 billion. Coincidentally, I'm very interested in that." Fred's expression shifted slightly. "Are you planning to use us to trade for the projects?" Zane nodded lightly and said, "I wasn't originally interested in breaking up couples, but for the sake of the projects, I have no choice but to separate you." "I don't want to." Tricia shouted loudly, even forgetting her fear. Zane looked at her in surprise. "Do you think you still have a say in this?" Tricia bit her lip and said nothing. Seeing the two of them silent, Zane stood up and instructed Mr. Six, "Find 2 people and send them to the Orne Group." "Okay." Just as Mr. Six was about to leave, Fred shouted, "Wait a minute." Zane looked at him in confusion. Fred gritted his teeth and said, "As long as you don't send us to the Orne Group, I will hand over my influence to you." "Your influence?" Zane looked at him in surprise, a puzzled expression on his face. Fred took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, his expression had calmed. "Since my family fell from grace, I went to Southeast Asia, where I made my first fortune, and then I used that to establish an intelligence network. Although it's still developing, the groundwork has already been laid. In less than 5 years, I will have information on the entire Americas." Zane raised an eyebrow, originally thinking he was just some local tough guy, but unexpectedly, he had built an intelligence network. Intelligence. That was a money-burning and very challenging business. Unexpectedly, Fred had managed to set it up. Zane smiled and said, "The love between you two truly opens my eyes. Miss Yates gave up the Yates Group for you, Mr. Larkin gave up his burgeoning intelligence network for Miss Yates." As he spoke, Zane applauded. Fred's gaze remained calm as he spoke. "Sir, are you satisfied now?" "Very satisfied. Although 10 billion worth of projects are great, they're insignificant compared to an intelligence network. But how can I trust that you will truly hand over your intelligence network to me?" Fred took out a small rolled-up piece of paper from his hair, very small, only the size of a finger. He handed it over and said, "This is the list of high-level members in the Wind Eye." After a pause, he continued, "The intelligence network is very complex and requires extreme caution, so I haven't let the high-level members meet. So as long as you can name them and give the signal, they will follow your orders." He looked affectionately at Tricia and continued, "As for me, they don't know about us. Our communication is all done on a self-created web page, and I can give you the signal and the web page." Zane nodded and said, "That works. Sir, I've given you the Wind Eye, so could you send us to Southeast Asia?" "No problem, but the prerequisite is that I need to confirm that your Wind Eye really exists." "All right." Fred was very calm now. Zane smiled and left Mr. Six to go outside. After staying in the tea room for about 2 hours, Mr. Six came out and said to Zane, "What he just said is true." Zane responded with a sound, his eyes slightly closed, fingers gently tapping on the table. Mr. Six remained silent, quietly waiting for Zane's instructions. After a while, Zane opened his eyes and asked, "Is there a way to completely remove him from controlling Wind Eye?" "Not too sure, but we can send someone to monitor them until we completely take control of Wind Eye." Zane nodded and said, "In that case, send them to Orn Group." "Okay, huh?" Mr. Six looked at Zane in surprise. Zane smiled and said, "Ginny really needs these 2 projects, so I must help her get them." Mr. Six had previously said that strength was reason, but in their line of work, they still value trust to some extent. Zane smiled and said, "After you send them over, contact Ben Salazar. He's been training for these past few days and should be out of the range of ordinary people. Plus, with you, it shouldn't be a problem to rescue them." Mr. Six understood Zane's meaning, gave a thumbs up, and said, "Win-win." Zane chuckled. Mr. Six win-win meant Zane winning twice. Mr. Six immediately sent someone to arrange it, and when Fred and Tricia got into the car, Fred began to curse loudly. He thought Zane had gone back on his word. The curses were unbearable. Even Zion Hall could hardly stand it, but he still held on. Upon arriving at Orn Group and clearly stating he wanted to see David Orn, the receptionist immediately made arrangements. David, upon hearing it was about Fred and Tricia, didn't even hold a meeting and rushed down with his people. When he saw the 2 behind Zion, a cold glint flashed in his eyes, and he walked over to Zion, saying, "Mr. Zion, thank you for your trouble." Zion smiled and replied, "Not a bother, just fulfill your promise." "Promise?" Zion grinned and said, "Those 2 projects, you said it yourself. But Mr. Zion doesn't seem to be in real estate, right?" "I'm not, but Ms. King from King Group certainly is." David understood immediately and told his secretary, "Prepare the contracts, we're going to see Ms. King at King Group." "Understood." Seeing this, Zion handed the people over to David and said softly, "My Mr. Six said that Ms. King is his sister. Anyone who dares to deceive or bully her, even at the cost of their life, shouldn't expect to get off easy." A flash of cold light appeared in David's eyes as he replied, "Not at all. Ms. King is also my friend. How could I possibly deceive her?" "That's good." Zion turned to leave, ignoring Fred and Tricia's curses. After Zion left, David approached the 2 and raised his hand to slap Tricia hard across the face. Her delicate face immediately showed the imprint of his fingers. "Bitch." Fred's eyes turned red. "David, if you have a problem, come at me, don't touch Tricia." "Don't worry, I will," David said casually, then instructed his secretary. "Send a few people to take them to my villa in the suburbs and keep an eye on them." "Understood." The secretary waved, and 2 burly men came over, escorting them toward the business car. David let out a long sigh and took out his phone to call Colin. As soon as the call connected, his expression softened, and his eyes filled with affection. "Son, I've found the people, they're at the villa in the suburbs." "Thank you, Dad." "Colin, it's not that I'm nagging, but with your status, why do you need to chase after any woman?" "Dad, I'm tired, I want to take a nap." All right, you sleep. If you need anything, just tell Dad immediately." After hanging up, David's face darkened, and he turned to his secretary, instructing, "Find out the relationship between Mr. Six and Ginny King." "Understood." As a leading family in J City, he wasn't particularly afraid of Mr. Six, he just found him slightly troublesome. Mr. Six had many desperate men under him, but he could also hire mercenaries with money. Though that would lead to mutual destruction in the end. But when it came to that, he still had the guts to tear off the face with Mr. Six. After all, in J City, who would dare to threaten him? At the suburban villa, Mr. Six and Ben Salazar were hiding in the reeds. They could see many people in the suburbs, bulging at their waists, clearly armed. Mr. Six glanced at the kid beside him, a serious look flashing in his eyes. He had already stepped out of the realm of ordinary people and could sense Ben's power. They had both received their techniques on the same day, and despite not slacking off in their training, he still fell short compared to Ben. Ben, feeling a bit bored, turned to Mr. Six and asked, "When do we strike?" Mr. Six took out his phone and dialed a number. Soon, the call connected, and a woman's voice came through. "Mr. Six. Has Miss King signed the contract with Orn Group?" "Signing now." After a pause, the woman continued. "Once signed, the money should arrive immediately. I will let you know as soon as it does." "All right." Mr. Six hung up the phone and waited quietly. He waited until it was dark. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, Mr. Six's phone vibrated. He took out his phone and answered the call. "Mr. Six, the money has arrived." "Good." Mr. Six hung up the phone and nodded at Ben Salazar. Both of them quickly donned hats and masks, pulling out prepared sponges to stuff into their clothes. In no time, two bulky men appeared. They exchanged a glance and hurried towards the villa. At the villa's entrance, two bodyguards immediately stopped Mr. Six, coldly asking, "What do you want?" Mr. Six struck first, grabbing one by the arm and suddenly using force to throw him to the ground. With a knee to his chest, the bodyguard let out a grunt and fainted. The other bodyguard, seeing this, quickly reached into his jacket, but before he could pull out his hand, he slumped over and lost consciousness. Ben chuckled, "Mr. Six, you're pretty quick." Mr. Six knew he was being mocked and rolled his eyes without replying. They both leaped up, clearing the 3-meter-high gate in one bound. Just as they landed, footsteps echoed around them. "You take the left, I'll take the right," Mr. Six said, then dashed to the right. Ben shrugged, clenched his fists, and a spark of excitement flashed in his eyes. This was the first time he had acted after his training. He was eager to test his strength. However, after taking down everyone, he frowned. This group was too weak. When he regrouped with Mr. Six, their expressions were similar. The two entered the villa. Soon, they found Fred and Tricia in the basement. Upon seeing the two, they were briefly startled before quickly regaining their composure. "Who are you?" Mr. Six lowered his voice, saying, "We're here to rescue you, let's go." Fred raised an eyebrow, about to speak, but footsteps sounded from outside. Mr. Six and Ben had no time to reveal their identities, each grabbed one and hurried out. As they exited the villa, they spotted a young man approaching. It was Colin Orne. Colin paused for a moment, then narrowed his eyes. "Get lost." Mr. Six kicked Colin in the chest, causing him to grunt and fly backward. The four hurried out. Suddenly, Colin shouted and clutched Mr. Six's leg. "Who are you? Where are you taking them? Damn it!" Mr. Six cursed as he noticed many car headlights approaching from a distance. Sure enough, David had already been informed of the situation here. Reinforcements were on the way. Although he and Ben weren't afraid, they couldn't take Fred and Tricia with them. After this incident, David would definitely hide them, making it hard to find them again. "Let go." A murderous intent flashed in Mr. Six's eyes. Colin didn't look at Mr. Six but gazed at Tricia with deep affection. "Tricia, do you really want to go with them?" "I love you, please stay." Tricia replied, "I don't love you. I love him. Please let us go." "No!" Colin shouted desperately, "I won't let you leave unless you step over my dead body." As he spoke, he clung even harder to Mr. Six's leg. Mr. Six glanced at the approaching lights, gritted his teeth, and seized Colin's neck. "Don't think I won't kill you, let go now." "No, I won't let you go." Colin insisted, his gaze fixed firmly on Tricia. "Damn it!" Mr. Six tightened his grip, and with a crack, Colin's eyes filled with disbelief. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. "Colin!" Tricia exclaimed, her eyes reddening. She knew how much Colin loved her, but not loving him back was not something she could compromise on just because he loved her. Mr. Six ignored Tricia's sorrow, pried Colin's hands away, and jumped with the two of them out of the villa. By the roadside, a disguised car waited. After stuffing them inside, he drove away. They reached the seaside, where a boat was docked. Mr. Six pushed them onto it, coldly saying, "This boat will take you to Q City, from there, find a way to Southeast Asia." After speaking, he tossed Fred a card, pointing at the young man beside him. "If you need anything, talk to him. He'll take care of you." Pausing, he looked at Fred. "Everyone on the boat will protect you." Fred understood Mr. Six's meaning and nodded slightly. The boat started and quickly disappeared into the night. Mr. Six stepped aside, and the car that had been parked earlier suddenly lost control, crashing into the sea. Soon, Ben swam out, and they exchanged a smile. They realized they had quite the synergy. Inside the villa, David stood beside Colin's lifeless body, his eyes bloodshot and his body trembling. "Mr. Orne." The secretary approached, calling out. David took a deep breath and coldly asked, "Where's the surveillance footage?" The secretary pulled out a tablet and opened the video feed. He could see two bulky men entering the villa, their skills impressive. Within 5 minutes, all the bodyguards he had hired were lying on the ground. David's expression was emotionless until he saw Colin pleading with Tricia to stay while holding onto Mr. Six's leg, and tears streamed down his face. In the end, Colin's head drooped, lifeless. David suddenly went mad, slamming the tablet onto the ground and stomping on it. "Find them. Investigate." You must track them down. I want them to suffer more than death." In the next moment, David's heart-wrenching voice echoed. "My son." David's son died, and he died in the family villa, which was a massive shock. Everyone in J City knew how much David Orne loved his only son. Calling it pampering would be an understatement. Now that he was dead, David would go mad. From the police department to the underworld, everyone was searching for the person who killed Colin Orne. In fact, David spent a fortune to find the head of the blacklist, wanting them to kill Fred and Tricia. The blacklist. It was the global ranking of assassins. Those who could make it onto the blacklist were all top-notch killers. The success rate of the blacklist was close to 90%, but the price was exorbitant. David was now mad. He didn't care about money anymore. He just wanted Fred and Tricia to pay with their lives for his son. At the Red Star billiards room, Zane sat in the tea room. Facing him, Zion was respectfully reporting. "Mr. Soulsby, we found the factory. It's 4,300 square meters, and some of the machines are usable. The annual rent is $8 million. After a pause, he continued, "The company has been registered, talent has been contacted, and the machines and equipment are on their way. If all goes well, we can be up and running in 3 days." Zane nodded slightly. "Okay, got it. How much money do we have left?" Zion said, "Not much. Starting the company didn't cost too much, most of it went into hiring talent and buying equipment and machines." After a pause, he added, "As long as Mr. Bates doesn't cause any trouble, the remaining money should be enough to sustain us until production." "Understood." Zane nodded and waved, signaling Zion to leave. As soon as Zion left, Mr. Six and Ben walked in. "Everything is set, no one will trace it back to us." Zane replied with an and looked at Ben. "Why are you still here? Go back and do your homework. Brother-in-law. Get lost." "All right." Ben didn't dare to say more and hurriedly left. After he left, Zane let out a long breath and said to Mr. Six, "Find a way to have wind completely under our control." "Okay, I'm on it." Zane stretched. He had been at the Red Star billiards room all day and was feeling a bit tired. Just as he was about to leave, he seemed to remember something and turned to Mr. Six. "Production can start in 3 days, and we'll officially enter the market in a month. Do you know any stars who can help us endorse the product?" Mr. Six looked a bit speechless. "Mr. Soulsby, you really overestimate me. How would I know any stars?" Zane didn't mind. It seemed he would have to find a star for the endorsement himself. However, top-tier stars were too expensive, and those at the bottom wouldn't be effective. Still short on cash. Zane muttered and walked out of the Red Star billiards room. When he got home, a fragrant aroma wafted over. Ginny came out of the kitchen, bringing dishes to the dining table. She had cooked herself. "You're back." Ginny smiled when she saw Zane. It was clear she was in a great mood. Zane smiled slightly and walked over, hugging her from behind. "Why are you so happy today?" Ginny looked up at Zane and said with a grin, "Don't you know?" Zane was taken aback for a moment and chuckled, "You really can't hide anything from you." Ginny laughed. She was thrilled that her man was so capable, and now the King family had nothing to say. "Humph." Maria came down from upstairs. Seeing Zane and Ginny's intimate actions, she snorted. Clearly, she also knew about Zane's accomplishments. A $2 billion project not only saved the King Group but could also elevate it to the next level. Still, she remained dissatisfied. Zane didn't care. He took Ginny's hand and sat down. Looking at the dishes on the table, Zane's fingers itched with anticipation. After 3 years of marriage, he had never eaten food cooked by Ginny. After taking a bite, he gave a thumbs up. He had to admit, Ginny truly was the dream wife everyone wished for, great in both the kitchen and the living room. Ginny squinted her eyes in satisfaction, smiling happily. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Ginny walked over to open the door, and seeing a man outside, her expression turned cold. "William, you're here, come in." But Maria had a beaming smile as she pushed Ginny aside and pulled William Mercer inside. William greeted warmly, "Aunt, sorry to intrude." As he spoke, he handed over an expensive nutritional supplement. "Not an intrusion at all. Ginny cooked today, as her childhood friend, you must try it." Maria's smile widened upon seeing the supplement, looking like a blooming flower. William shot a provocative glance at Zane before changing his shoes and walking in. He sat beside Maria, looking eager to please. Ginny's expression was frosty. She disliked William's presence, but since he was invited by Maria, she had to endure it. Pretending not to see William, she chatted and laughed with Zane. She served Zane some food, Zane fed she a bite. Their affection was palpable.